Imagine opening a map of Africa and noticing something strange. Dozens of countries, separated by straight borders, with different names and ancient cultures. Yet in many of them, the official language is still French. From Senegal to Chad, from Côte d'Ivoire to Gabon, from Madagascar to Mali, the French presence seems to stretch across the continent like a long, silent and persistent shadow. But how did this happen? How did a European country, smaller than many African territories, manage to dominate such a large part of Africa? And why did France, more than almost any other power, leave such deep marks on regions so far apart? To understand this story, we need to go back to a time when Africa was not seen by European empires as a continent of peoples, kingdoms, and civilizations. It was seen as a game board. A board of resources, trade routes, military prestige, and global power. In the 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Machines, factories, railways, and modern armies were transforming countries into industrial powers. But industrialization had an insatiable appetite. An appetite for raw materials, an appetite for markets, an appetite for territory. And it was in this context that Africa became the object of a scramble at an astonishing pace. France had already suffered painful losses in other parts of the world. It had lost influence in the Americas, endured military defeats, and watched the British Empire become a massive global power. So for Paris, conquering African territories was not merely an economic issue. It was also a matter of national pride. France wanted to prove that it was still a great power, and this is where the central point of our story begins. France did not end up with a large portion of Africa by chance. It advanced through strategy, diplomacy, violence, forced alliances, and an obsession with building a continuous empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. But there is something even more important. The French occupation did not begin all at once. It spread like a stain across the map. First coastal outposts, then fortresses. Next unequal treaties. Later military campaigns into the interior. And when the European powers realized they were racing against one another, they decided to organize the competition. That was when the Berlin Conference, held between 1884 and 1885, came into play. One of the most symbolic moments in the colonial partition of Africa. The European powers discussed rules for recognizing occupations and preventing wars among themselves. While African peoples had no voice in the process, the question is, how did France take advantage of this moment to expand its control so dramatically? The answer begins now. When the Berlin Conference ended, the map of Africa was still far from reflecting reality. On paper, the European powers had established rules. But on the African continent, whoever truly controlled a territory had to prove it with soldiers. Administrations, roads, fortresses, and flags planted firmly in the ground. That was precisely the moment when France accelerated its expansion. Starting from Algeria, which had been conquered decades earlier, the French began pushing farther and farther into the interior of the continent. Their objective was ambitious: to create a vast colonial corridor linking North Africa with the regions of West and Central Africa. The larger this continuous territory became, the greater France's international prestige and the greater its ability to exploit natural resources. But this advance was far from peaceful. Military expeditions crossed deserts, savannas and forests, confronting African kingdoms that resisted fiercely. In many places, local leaders refused to accept treaties imposed by Europeans. Others quickly realized that those agreements concealed something much greater: the complete loss of their sovereignty. Even so, French military power was enormous for its time. Modern machine guns, heavy artillery, steamships, and increasingly efficient logistics gave the French a decisive advantage over armies that often fought with traditional weapons or vastly inferior firearms. Even so, many campaigns lasted for years, demonstrating that the conquest of Africa was far from easy. At the same time that soldiers advanced, Another element played a fundamental role: imperial diplomacy. In many regions, French officials signed treaties with local chiefs, promising protection, trade, or cooperation. In practice, many of these documents were written in French, contained clauses unknown to African leaders, or were interpreted in completely different ways by each side. Shortly afterward, Paris used those same treaties as justification for declaring those territories part of the French Empire, but conquering land was only the beginning. Those territories had to be transformed into productive colonies. The French administration redrew borders, established new capitals, introduced tax systems, and forced millions of Africans to work on the construction of roads, railways, and colonial infrastructure. Products such as cotton, peanuts, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and minerals began supplying the French economy, while much of the wealth generated left Africa for Europe. And there was another, even deeper objective. France believed that its culture should be spread throughout the world. They called this idea the civilizing mission. Schools taught only the French language. Administrations banned local customs in many regions, and many Africans were encouraged or forced to abandon their traditions in favor of French political, legal, and cultural models. Behind the rhetoric of progress was a clear strategy. The more French a colony became, the easier it would be to keep it under control. However, this seemingly limitless expansion was about to encounter enormous obstacles. Across different parts of Africa, leaders, warriors, and entire populations decided they would not accept living under foreign rule. And some of these acts of resistance would completely change the course of French colonial history. Despite France's military superiority, conquering a territory did not mean truly controlling it. In virtually every occupied region, revolts, wars of resistance, and organized movements emerged to expel the colonizers. The history of French expansion in Africa was not merely a sequence of European victories. It was also a succession of battles fought by peoples who refused to lose their lands, their culture, and their freedom. In West Africa, one of France's greatest adversaries was Samurai Touré, founder of a powerful empire that extended across areas now belonging to Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire. For years, he reorganized his army, acquired modern weapons, and employed guerrilla tactics to slow the French advance. Even against a technologically superior enemy, he managed to inflict defeats and forced France to mobilize thousands of soldiers in extremely costly campaigns. In other regions, resistance took different forms. Some kingdoms chose to negotiate while strengthening their defenses. Others launched popular uprisings against abusive taxes, forced recruitment, and land confiscation. In many cases, men, women, and children participated in the struggle, demonstrating that colonization was not passively accepted, as it was often portrayed for decades. But France had a long-term plan. Whenever a revolt was crushed, a new administrative structure was established. Colonial governors assumed political control, military officers remained in strategically important regions, and a carefully organized bureaucracy took charge of administering millions of people. Gradually, an enormous colonial system emerged, known as French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, bringing vast territories under a single administration directly linked to Paris. This made it possible to control taxation, organize trade, and exploit natural resources far more efficiently. At the same time, thousands of Africans were recruited to serve in the French army itself, known as the Tirailleurs Sénégalais. These soldiers did not come only from Senegal. They came from various French colonies and fought in conflicts around the world, including both world wars. Many believed they were defending the homeland that had been presented to them by the colonial administration. Others saw military service as one of the few opportunities for social advancement. There is a profound irony in this story. While thousands of Africans risked their lives defending France in Europe, their own homelands remained without political autonomy. They were helping preserve a country that still ruled the nations from which they came. After the Second World War, this contradiction became impossible to ignore. African soldiers returned home, asking why they had fought for Europe's freedom while continuing to live under colonial rule. Intellectuals, students, religious leaders, and nationalist movements began demanding independence. The desire for freedom spread rapidly across the continent. It was then that the vast empire built over decades began to show cracks. The question was no longer whether the colonies would gain independence, but when it would happen. And more importantly, would France truly leave Africa behind? Or would it find a way to continue influencing the continent even after the official end of colonialism? In the 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Africa. Within just a few years, most French colonies officially became sovereign nations. On the map, it looked like the end of an empire. National flags replaced the French flag, new presidents took office, and millions of Africans celebrated the birth of their own countries. But the real story was only just beginning. Although colonial administration had come to an end, French influence remained deeply entrenched. The French language continued to be the official language in many of these new states. Legal, educational, and administrative systems remained heavily inspired by the French model. French companies continued to exploit strategic natural resources, while military agreements ensured the presence of French troops in several regions considered essential to their interests. This is how a concept known as France-Afrique emerged. The term came to describe the complex network of political, economic, and military relationships through which Paris maintained enormous influence over many of its former colonies. In some cases, African governments depended on French support to remain in power. In others, French companies controlled key sectors such as mining, energy, telecommunications, and infrastructure. Not everyone accepted this situation. Over the past few decades, several African countries have begun to challenge this model. New governments demanded greater economic autonomy, renegotiated contracts, and reduced the French military presence. In places such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, recent political changes have shown that part of the population has come to view the former colonial power no longer as a partner, but as a symbol of an influence that never completely disappeared. And it is precisely here that we find the answer to the question that opened this video. France did not gain control of a large part of Africa simply because it possessed a powerful army. It combined military technology, diplomacy, rivalry among European powers, economic interests, strategic planning, and a colonial ideology that believed it was legitimate to expand its rule over other peoples. The Berlin Conference accelerated this process, but it was France's ability to consolidate its administration and integrate its colonies into a vast imperial project that made its African empire one of the largest in modern history. However, no conquest lasts forever. African peoples resisted, preserved much of their identities, and after decades of struggle, achieved their independence. Even so, the borders drawn during the colonial period, the official languages, the political systems, and many of the economic relationships that exist today continue to reflect decisions made more than a century ago. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this story. When we look at a modern map of Africa, we are not just seeing independent countries. We are looking at the marks left by one of the greatest colonial projects in history, whose effects continue to influence politics, economics, culture, and international relations to this day. And now we want to hear your opinion. Do you believe that France's influence over parts of Africa has truly ended, or has it simply changed form over time? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy historical documentaries that reveal the behind-the-scenes stories of the world's greatest events, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are still many fascinating stories waiting to be told.